I didn't want to be host. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone.
Yeah, I didn't want to host anything. Yeah, you can start. Yeah. Yeah.
So everyone sees this?
Yeah, we see that. Yeah, we see that. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah. Firstly, apologies about that. Sorry about that.
It's
Okay,
okay. Go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
cool. So this will present my PhD dissertation proposal on research on data augmentation for deep learning. Firstly, thank you to Dr. Koshkopter for advising and mentoring, and the committee for supervising the dissertation. So a summary of the contributions: I published 10 papers, 9 as first author, presented work at 4 different conferences, and one of these papers has been pretty impactful in achieving a good amount of citations. So to go over the chapters, so there's kind of like 4 theoretical sort of overfitting, data augmentation, generalization, and then applications of deep learning, and then 3 kind of the different experimental pathways it took with like image classification experiments, language modeling, and this COVID-19 patient record experiments. So starting off with introduction, and also just generally with this proposal presentation, I'm going to kind of pass over a lot to kind of keep it within the 45-minute window. So introduction, we'll cover an overview of what deep neural networks are, gradient descent, labeling data for optimization, learning, and then kind of this idea of generalization and what it is. So starting off with deep neural networks, and a very simple picture of it is this idea that you have some input that's represented as, say, 2 dimensions, x1, x2, and you have multiple layers of processing it. You have in nonlinear activations is the A sums up x1, x2, B, x1, x2, and you process it with multiple layers and eventually have some output prediction y hat. And that y hat is compared to some labeling function of a ground truth y, and that's where you get the signal for optimization. So it's differentiable through that optimization throughout every intermediate computation in this deep neural network computation graph. So the key is a gradient descent is more so the mechanism of how that works, and I'll dive into the details of that with the full presentation. But a key to this is how you label the data for learning. So with supervised learning, you often label the y's. You have some human label, this y should be this. It could be regression, classification, multi-class classification. In self-supervised learning, you're able to derive that ground truth y sort of algorithmically from the data. So in language modeling, you're able to mask out a token and then predict the masked out token, but the ground truth label for what that masked out token can be self-supervised. You don't need humans to annotate that ground truth y. Semi-supervised describes a combination of these 2 things. Reinforcement learning describes where that ground truth y comes after several predictions. So you make several mappings from some input to some action, and then after a long sequence of this, you eventually receive the signal. Multitask learning would describe optimizing for, you would attach multiple predictions onto the same kind of base network. And then multimodal learning describes having multiple data modalities as input. So like images and text and audio and these kinds of things. So one of the key topics of this is generalization. So with generalization, we generally have this independently and identically distributed assumption of statistical learning theory, where we assume that we have this big chunk of data and we randomly sample our training and our test set from this identical distribution of data. And I think this is one of the key ideas that I really was exploring in this dissertation, is this assumption that we can have some kind of train test split and this IID principle. So to begin my investigation into overfitting and into data augmentation, I was primarily interested in this problem of overfitting. So overfitting describes when you continue to optimize the training loss shown in blue, and the testing error actually increases. So if you have a train test split of cat and dog images, and you're training a classifier to distinguish between cats and dogs, it optimizes on the cats and dogs, but then it doesn't generalize to that test set. And it just gets better and better at classifying the test set without generalizing. So really what you want is on the right, where as the training error decreases, the testing error decreases as well. And this is especially problematic if you're trying to train a deep neural network with, say, 50 cats and 50 dogs, instead of the big data case where you can just kind of throw a ton of data at it and kind of achieve better generalization that way. So that's what motivated my initial interest in data augmentation, is trying to prevent overfitting. So I started off by looking at the examples of this. So to begin with, this is taken from one of the experimental papers, but you see how you have this original ship image, like low resolution ship image on the left, and you rotate, you horizontally flip it, you change the color space, and you do these kind of transformations to images, which preserve the semantic label of ship, frog, airplane, and you get to kind of blow up the data set size this way. It was the original motivation for why you would want to do this. So first I looked at all the examples out there of how do people augment images to create a bigger data set in a label preserving way. So I found these kernel filters where you say Gaussian blur an image, geometric transformations like rotating it, like flipping it, these affine transformations where you multiply the pixel grid with some kind of transformation matrix, random erasing where you crop out grids from the picture, mixing images where you average the pixels of two images, color space transformation, say you make it more red, more blue, brighter, darker, these kind of things. And then these really interesting deep learning approaches. And this, as the time of my PhD progressed, this space evolved in a really incredible way. This kind of generative data augmentation using deep generative models to be able to generate novel data. So it started out with adversarial training where you would directly optimize some noise map that would cause the model to make an incorrect prediction, but it would be imperceptible to humans. So you would still have the same label, neural style transfer, combining styles, and then this idea of GAN data augmentation, where you would just outright generate novel images to add to the data set. Then this kind of meta learning, which are the controllers over how you sample augmentations and how you integrate that into training. So then following this coverage of image examples, I was really curious about text and natural language processing. I became super interested in that, especially once the transformers and the language modeling started to take over. I really wanted to understand how this would apply to that as well. So the naive text examples are, say, random swapping, I am jogging to I tiger jogging, you swap am with tiger. Random insertion, you randomly add a word like I am jogging, I am salad jogging. Random deletion, random synonym replacement with being a little more semantic where you replace jogging for running. So eventually I, surveyed all these applications and came up with a similar taxonomy for the text augmentations out there. You have these rule-based transformations, which are like the synonym replacement or the insertion, graph structured augmentation, where you use a knowledge graph to try to be more semantic about, so it's not just synonym replacement, and you can kind of try to replace paraphrases by having a graph structure of how entities are related to other entities. Mix up is where you just smash together two paragraphs or sentences, and then again these deep learning approaches became super interesting, and they were especially successful in text, with the most recent thing being the ChatGPT or the GPT 3.5 models, and the way that they can generate novel data that you could use to supplement your training set for text classification or something like that. So back translation means you take some text and say you translate it to another language and back, so English to German back to English will produce a novel instance. Style translation, say you translate an email to a more formal style, this kind of idea for how you can blow up the data size. And this generative augmentation thing has just been super powerful and super new over the time of my research. So to kind of, this generative data augmentation is the thing that I think is the most cutting edge and really emerging a lot. So I began researching this by seeing this kind of GAN idea where the generator generates images and the discriminator classifies whether this came from the generator or from the original training set. And so the idea being, once you optimize the generator, then you can just sample random noise vectors shown on the far left and generate new images to add to the training set and create a big data set that way. So then what happened is this ChatGPT thing, and this has been crazy. So what you can do is you say, please add another sentence to this passage, preserving that the passage contains the information of the atomic number of oxygen is 8. And you added a context like from the squad question answering data set, and it can, add new data to it, paraphrase it, things like this to increase the size of the data set. So this was my initial exploration, is this interest in learning from limited data. But then quickly I became more interested in this idea of generalization testing and robustness, and how data augmentation can be used to show that generalization and deep learning is very poorly understood. So let's come back to the ID assumption, where you say that all the data is going to be kind of sampled from the same distribution. And this idea, I thought it made a ton of sense at first, this idea that you say I have 1 million images, and so you can kind of cover the entire distribution of images that way. But then what I thought was surprising is this failure in robustness. So this paper was, we'll get into the details more of this experimental paper, but the high level takeaway is that when you take an image classifier can perform really well on classifying cats and dogs and airplanes, But then if you just transform it by saying cropping it or rotating it or flipping it, the test set performance like suddenly decreases a lot. If you augment it with semantic preserving transformations, it can't generalize to that, which I thought was really surprising. So there are a lot of other ways of kind of looking at what generalization means. So in addition to generalizing to say rotations of the test set, this paper DomainNet studies domain translation. So you say train it on real photographic images and then test it on sketches or these quick draw illustrations or paintings, infographics, clip art, like generalizing to some novel style of image. And it also can't do that. So another experimental investigation was this language modeling one particular, like a subset of text information, and seeing how well it can generalize across the different information sources. So if you train it on the code examples, can it generalize to the API reference? And again, it can't do that. So this was very motivated by my PhD advisor's expertise in class imbalance and understanding that generalization testing, when you have, say, imbalanced cases, it fails to generalize to the minority case. And so I had this kind of perspective of wanting to dig deeper into generalization testing and understanding the kind of performance of the models. So we'll start off with the experiments, starting off with image classification experiments with CIFAR-10. So CIFAR-10 is a very accessible data set to begin doing like low budget research with deep learning for computer vision. You have these 32 by 32 low resolution images and you classify them into 10 categories, and you can train one of these models maybe in like 5 hours. And so that's a significant difference from ImageNet, where it would take like a couple days to train a quality model on it. So this paper, this is the paper that was shown earlier, investigating the generalization of classifiers with augmented test sets. And this was a detailed exploration of characterizing this robustness phenomenon, seeing if the convolutional-based ResNets differed from the attention-based vision transformers in this kind of generalization. We found some slight differences with it, with the vision transformer being a little more robust, but generally we characterized all these different augmentations from cropping, rotation, Gaussian noise, adding, and showing that it couldn't generalize to these data sets. And we showed that even further, you can train it with the augmentation and it might generalize to that augmentation, but not all augmentations. And I think that's pretty interesting. So another thing we looked at with this is to see if there was a correlation in the inductive biases in ResNets and vision transformers with the global and local augmentation. So attention-based networks, they attend to the entire image at every step, whereas the convolutional network processes the image in local windows. So we looked if that was somehow correlated with the robustness to, say, global priors that preserve the entire structure of the image, or local priors like this extreme cropping case that we imagine maybe the convolutional filter would be better at. But we didn't find that the inductive biases between augmentations and architectures corresponded with their generalization ability at all. So the next exploration, and I think this is more like generally impactful, is trying to see how we can introduce a loss function that will allow for better robustness. So we have this consistency loss, where what we do is usually you take this image, you pass it through some, say, neural backbone, like it could be, efficient B7 is a convolutional model, but it could be the vision transformer or something like that. Then you usually flatten it out into vectors and then put it into a classification vector. So what we had is, in addition to the prediction of SHIP, this kind of optimization, we also had the consistency loss on its augmented counterpart. So you augment the image, and then you also have this vector or logic consistency, where you do the KL divergence of these two representations of the data in addition to the high-level class prediction. So following these image classification experiments, I was really interested in language modeling and wanted to really get into doing some language modeling experiments. So the idea behind Keras-BERT is, well, maybe starting with language modeling. Language modeling, you take data from the internet and you say, and you mask out a token. So I'm going outside to take a mask, and you've masked out walk. So the language model tries to predict walk as what word fits in this context. And so you do this with really large models on massive scales of data, and it's shown to do pretty impressive things. So the idea here was, again, I was always motivated sort of similar to the CIFAR-10 and trying to find like a low budget experiment that would be more accessible. So I thought, instead of language modeling the internet with a billion parameter model, which would be really difficult to do, let me try to find a subset of data that would be interesting to language model and study the properties of a smaller scale language model on a more specific corpus of text. So what I did is I manually scraped all these Keras information. So Keras is a deep learning programming framework used to build these models and train them. So I took all this information and manually curated it to prepare it for the language model. So what it would do is, like you would mask out parts of the code. So Keras at applications dot, in this case, maybe it's ResNet here, something like that. So in Keras-BERT, we did a lot of experiments with 80 million parameter Roberta-based transformers. We, just showed the basic kind of effectiveness of this, designed some sort of intuitive tests that show, where it can fill in the mass token and it is sensible in how it did it. Then kind of an interesting thing is we extended this into the book chapter is showing the domain generalization. But before getting into that further, we also looked at some details like the impact of pre-trained fine-tuning on this. And we didn't actually find a good result in transfer learning from a pre-trained Roberta that's trained on Wikipedia and a Wikipedia tokenizer to then transferring that to optimizing it on the Keras information. We didn't find that was useful, which is sort of counter the conventional wisdom on this transfer learning thing works for all cases. Then we tested the zero-shot ability of, at the time of this paper, the biggest zero-shot language model that was publicly available was GPT-NEO, which is about 6 billion parameters. Today, the ChatGPT model has been made publicly accessible, and they're not exactly clear on what model it is, but it's about 175 billion parameters was the GPT-3, so it's probably somewhere in that range. So following just showing that it can language model Keras, basically, we wanted to dive deeper into that domain generalization concept because I thought that was extremely interesting. So firstly, but quickly to describe a little further. So we did these closed tests, which are like this, qualitative evaluation of the mass class groups layers into an object with training and inference features, and that's referring to the Keras model class. And so we see that it's able to do this. So the transition is then we split it into the 3 data sources and explore the difference in, taking one of the data sources out of the model training. And this is really interesting because you think about like where you're getting your data from. As your data evolves, you have these different high-level sources of data, and seeing how it generalizes to other sources of data I thought was really interesting. So in the book chapter, we added more data from more sources. So we added Kaggle notebooks that use Keras, Medium articles that reference Keras, and GitHub repositories that use Keras. And so the composition of our data set changed a lot because there's a lot of GitHub data. So, suddenly GitHub became like 40% of the data. The other thing maybe went from like 63 to 20% and so on. So the composition of these data sources will evolve over time as you're doing something like, training this language model to, do these things in the real world. So what we did is we left out certain domains of data and explored the kind of the generalization with, leaving out the Keras code examples. How well will it then generalize to the Keras code example? So you see this kind of diagonal where if it's left out, the error is going to be higher on it. And then we also did this by training on just one source to try to see which one source of data generalizes the best across the other data sets. So we see the Keras code examples has the lowest average test results, whereas the Keras API reference actually has a really high test loss when trying to generalize from the Keras API reference to other data sources. And maybe this will be interesting more so also as you think about like learning resources and learning paths, and you look at like the log prop of if you were to study this, how would it generalize to other kind of material and that kind of idea. So the next big experiment was looking at this COVID-19 patient survival classification. So this was an interdisciplinary team with myself, Dr. Koshkofter, and then the College of Nursing, and then the Memorial Healthcare System. So we had this data set that was about 5,600 COVID-19 patient records, and we had a lot of features, but they were kind of messy. So in the end, the modeling experiments were done with 31 tabular features, which is mostly demographic information, previous conditions. And we do have some treatment information in there, but we didn't use that in the experiment. So to get a little flavor of what this is, we looked at the survival outcome classification, and this is the distribution of expired or survived with respect to the age variable. So, you see, obviously, being older correlating. It's a dark thing to be talking about, but this is this was the classification task. So the first experiment was just in looking at the predicting the initial treatment decision. So when I was first looking at this data set, I was very interested in reinforcement learning and this idea of treatment trajectory forecasting. So the first thing to do was this idea of behavior cloning, where you usually initialize a reinforcement learning model by having it copy human decisions. This is how like DeepMind's Mu0, AlphaGo, all those models, they are first trained with supervised learning to just copy the decisions the human expert made. Similarly, the latest ChatGPT, the way that it works is you initialize it with GPT-3, and then the humans will write responses to prompts sent to the commercial API. ChatGPT initially copies this writing, and then it goes on to be trained with sort of a more unsupervised reinforcement learning with reward model kind of thing. But anyways, so this idea of behavior cloning seemed like a really important first step. So what we did is we had these different we had 5 different initial treatment decisions, and so we just showed the impact of class imbalance and how the effectiveness of random oversampling could help predict these initial treatment decisions. But from there, we kind of decided to instead look more at just using these features to predict the eventual outcome. And I think there's obviously like a lot of in the middle of what you could do with this. And I think this we kind of needed better data, but I do think this general space of like deep learning for biomedical informatics is going to be a massive area of this. So what we looked at then is predicting the survival classification. And so the really interesting thing that we did here was language interface fine tuning. So typically what you do when you have electronic health records, it's a mix of like numeric categorical variables, and you try to put it into, say, like a traditional logistic regression support vector machine decision tree, XGBoost, or maybe you try like a deep multi-layer perceptron network where you just connect everything to everything, and that kind of helps with dealing with the heterogeneity of tabular data and mixed variable types. But what we tried is, and showed that it's on par with these other techniques, is translating the tabular data into a text record. So they call this data to text now, where you parse through the tabular records and you translate it into text such that it's easier to transfer learn from, say, a model trained on Wikipedia to then transfer learning. And especially because we only tested an 80 million parameter model, because it's an engineering challenge to figure out how to get these billion parameter models to transfer into this problem, particularly because we can't send this data across the internet. This needs to be private data, the health records. We can't like send this to the OpenAI API because, you know, it can't like give this data away. So it's difficult to figure out how exactly we're going to use one of these large models for this task. So we just tested it with an 80 million parameter model. Generally in deep learning, scale has been shown to be just like a, you know, like a super impactful thing. So we would imagine that the blue is the language interface fine tuning. I would imagine that we would surpass this if we continued to scale it, but it's not super obvious how to do that. So another thing that I did was look at just broadly applications of deep learning, and particularly in the context of looking at applications of deep learning for COVID-19, but this really helped kind of shape my focus and my understanding of what deep learning is capable of. So to start off, the focus of this was to compare with, you know, to try to illuminate new applications of deep learning. So, you know, we compare at the time of publishing this, there were 2 other survey papers out there that had titles like, you know, how artificial intelligence can be used to fight the pandemic, or data science for the pandemic. These kind of titles was what we surveyed. So we saw things like, you know, estimate the structure of the COVID-19 protein, identify drugs that could be repurposed to treat the virus, propose new compounds for drug development, vaccine targets, you know, diagnosis. So a lot of these different things that we saw for how people are using these machine learning systems to, you know, help with miscellaneous pandemic tasks. So to kind of take a tour of some of the ones that I thought were the most impactful, this particular application has really kind of changed the course of my career, and it's something that I'm doing now, you know, with working. And this kind of idea of deep learning for search, I think, is incredibly interesting. So I originally learned about this idea of BM25, TF-IDF, these kind of lexical keyword scoring methods where you basically match the query with the documents based on how many keywords they match. But then this idea was to take vectors extracted from deep learning representations, like going all the way back to the, if I can do a long range reference here, all the way back to this image vector. So you would represent this image with this vector, and you can use this vector to search for similar images. So I thought that idea of vector representations of deep learning to use in search was just a profoundly interesting idea and a novel idea. So So basically also what they do is they plug these into these entire systems where you do a hybrid search where you mix the vector search retrieval with these keyword scoring methods. Then you have some kind of ranking function, like a cross encoder or something like that. Then you pass these into question answering models as context. And this idea now I think is just super impactful because we have this ChatGPT thing, which is like such a powerful general purpose reasoning model, but it needs the specific context to be effective. You don't want to the idea that you're going to fine tune these models on your particular data. It sounds horribly expensive because the ChatGPT model, it's like 175 billion parameters. There's some research in like sparse fine tuning, but generally it's such a task to fine tune on your data. So instead, if you can just retrieve the context and then just put the context into the input window to something like one of these large models that are generally available on these commercial APIs, but that kind of idea of question answering, I thought this was really impactful. So particularly for COVID-19, this was about drug repurposing mostly. So trying to mine the literature to find drugs that maybe could be repurposed to target these particular proteins and bind inhibition and things like that. So another thing that made a lot of sense to me was medical image analysis. So say you're comparing chest x-rays and you want to try to do prognosis, like predict how the COVID-19 because I think it's mostly a lung condition. So see how this is going to evolve by looking at these medical images made a lot of sense. So I looked at a lot of papers that look at just even prior to COVID, how they were using chest x-rays. A lot of it was for the initial diagnosis, and they create these kind of like trees where you see all these different kinds of like diagnoses that would be related to like pneumonia sort of. And so that was kind of thinking it's translating that research into the COVID-19 diagnosis and prognosis. So this other idea I think is really related to what we were trying to do with the MHS data, but we really didn't have a lot of this kind of data. But this idea of precision diagnostics, where you could have like the genomics, all these kind of like gene testing things. I think this, as we get more medical data, this whole prediction of diagnosis and prognosis will be really impactful. I think also just like the drug interaction effects will be greatly supplemented by this kind of data being available. So protein structure prediction is another like big success of deep learning, and I also like it a lot because it has the multiple sequence alignment like retrieval augmented component to it. So in addition to being this graph neural network that predicts the final structure, it also is retrieval augmented, and it looks at the structures of sequences that have this multiple sequence alignment is like a dynamic programming technique where you line up the amino acid nucleotide sequences and see the most similar things. And so you can supplement the prediction of a current protein by retrieving similar proteins. So also from this, we looked at some limitations of deep learning. So some of the big limitations of deep learning at the time, and most of them still are a problem, as interpretability, where you don't really know why it made the prediction. And that's another reason why I like the retrieval augmented so much, is because you can see the context you used to make the prediction. So you could rotate that out and have a better sense of that. This learning from limited labeled data thing, that's what initially inspired my interest in this. And I don't know if that's as much of a problem anymore with the large model kind of setting. It's definitely still a problem if you're trying to just optimize a model from scratch. But these large models have achieved this like few shot learning ability where you don't necessarily optimize them with gradient updates anymore. Number 3, generalization testing. I think this is still just a massive problem in deep learning, is that we really don't understand the failure cases and how they fail. And so for some of these critical COVID-19 applications, that could be super problematic for things like self-driving cars. And we generally don't know how deep learning models fail. And then data privacy, this is like what stopped us from being able to apply the OpenAI APIs to our COVID-19 data set, is we can't send this data across the network. We need it to be on premise in the kind of the Cocoa cluster in order for us to process it with the models. So kind of concluding with some of the discussion topics that kind of I think are on the cutting edge of this is, so firstly, I did this image data augmentation survey, and then I generalized it to trying to do text data augmentation. So I've been thinking very heavily about just image data compared to text data. And I think it's very interesting how what we're doing with text data is we're artificially embedding it into a continuous space. So it's a similar kind of continuous processing of a discrete data, but I think there's a lot of interesting overlaps here with, say, like the CLIP models that process image and text. I'm also very interested in structured versus unstructured data. So with the electronic health records, it's a structured representation, a structured tabular data, but we translate it into this. It's not quite, generally you hear that like deep learning creates features out of unstructured data, but it's not quite unstructured. It's like a structured, because it's a structured text. It's not just like natural text that you get from the internet. So I think it's an interesting case of that. Then I'm very interested in this ChatGPT thing, of course, and I think sort of this reinforcement learning from human feedback, this kind of the way that a chatbot could talk to another chatbot and they can sort of live in this simulation. I think that's extremely interesting. Then I'm really interested in causal inference and data augmentation. I think the way that we can introduce data augmentations that maybe flip the label on purpose and using that as the interface of causal discovery in the kind of causal DAG sense is very interesting. Then the last thing is I see the emerging thing of how to use these large models is you prompt them. And prompting them describes like transforming the task into some input representation that's understandable by the model. And I see that as data augmentation. So the end of the dissertation is sort of making that argument on why prompting is similar to data augmentation. So in conclusion, the presentation is going to be about the overview of deep learning, basically, what are the different deep neural networks? So maybe let me come back to the initial slide. Was sort of describing the overview of deep neural networks. So the overview of deep neural networks, what is gradient descent? How do we label data? And how are we generally perceiving this idea of generalization? Then diving into overfitting. This was the initial motivation of my thesis dissertation, is to try to understand better data augmentation as the solution to overfitting. So then diving into data augmentation, what it is, and characterizing it in image data and text data, and then generalization. So, my interest, once I started doing experiments, shifted quickly from overcoming overfitting from limited data and more into this robustness testing thing, because I thought that this result was such a head scratcher to see that this image classifier couldn't generalize to the test set when it's been rotated or horizontally flipped. I thought that was just it really made me kind of lose confidence in deep learning a little bit. So I thought it was a really important thing to kind of dig further into. So following that kind of overview of the theoretical things that guide the thinking, the concrete experiments around image classification, around Keras-BERT, and then around the COVID-19 patient records, then sort of concluding with just this tour of like all the things deep learning is doing, particularly through the lens of applications to COVID-19. Then some discussion topics that I think are just things that I'm still kind of wrapping my own head around as I'm trying to understand the results of all this, and then just sort of summarizing the dissertation. So yeah, and I'll augment these slides to put that at the end. But yeah, so thank you so much. That's kind of the proposal of what this paper will be, this this dissertation on covering the experiments and investigation into data augmentation for deep learning.
Thank you, Connor, that this was a very, very but a good presentation. I know it was high level. You didn't go into details, but this is. I have a question for you and then I ask committee members that, have you seen any study that compares or look at the few shots learning versus the class imbalance learning? Have you seen any in that area?
I think it's extremely interesting, the idea of few shot examples would be, you have like 4 labeled examples that you put into the input, and yeah, that kind of seeing if the imbalance from the pre-training is then impacted by the fine-tuning. Yeah, it's an extremely interesting idea. I haven't seen anything that particularly focused on that angle, but I can see what you're getting at, this idea that you could kind of prompt a balanced classifier by just having the few shot demonstration of the task be balanced, or in the prompt you put in that prior explicitly in text, like this minority class only appears 15% of the time, and it's not quite like a Bayesian network way of doing it where you had all this complicated stuff. It's just like a natural language interface where you just literally describe the imbalance problem to the model and see if it can reason across that. I think that's an extremely interesting idea.
Yeah. Okay, good. How about the committee members? Any questions, any comments by Mehrdad and Ding Ding?
Well, first, congratulations on your best student paper. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. So for your augmentation method, do you think you need to compare with other other augmentation method, or I like Tardy mentioned the imbalance data study? Uh, do you try to compare different methods?
So I tried so when I was doing these experiments, when I was doing these experiments on these experiments, I was exploring different, like, just sort of in the set of rotation, cropping, Gaussian noise, and then this image you see here is this algorithm called rand augment. So yeah, I'm sorry, I was trying to like get the right amount of detail in this talk. Maybe I left out some details that were important, but it's rand augment is like a sampling in a big space of augmentation. So you have like 15 augmentations and they have different like magnitude parameters associated with them. And so you like randomly sample configurations of it to cover a large space. Is that the question?
Yeah, okay. That's part of that's one kind of the other augmentation method, right? Do you also compare with other like sampling method to solve the problem? Some you can use different sampling methods.
I like that idea a lot. Like the like with random. So I was thinking about the idea of random oversampling with augmentation, where I think it would be like a slight benefit to random oversampling. You're sort of sampling another minority instance, but to augment it, but you're already kind of augmenting it. So I wasn't really able to draw that connection because, like, say the idea was you're only training on unaugmented data, then in the random oversampling case, instead of just drawing another minority instance, you would augment it, and then you like have a sort of a novel instance that way. And that's kind of like the SMOTE idea in tabular random oversampling. But most of the computer vision workflows I was mostly doing the data augmentation experiments with, you're always going to be augmenting it. So I didn't think that particular sampling case, but I think so the generative augmentation stuff that kind of came out like 2 weeks ago with the ChatGPT thing. So I think with ChatGPT, what you could do is we have this mix-up thing where mix-up is like you take sentences from like say it's like an IMDb movie review, and we're going to take two different positive reviews and try to like combine the best of them. And what they used to do is you just like take the first two sentences, the last two sentences, and just boom. But like the ChatGPT you could say like write a semantic mix of these two reviews to produce a novel one. And I do think that could be really interesting. I'm trying to get that done with the Flares deadline on the 13th, but I'm like really busy lately, so I don't know if I get it done in time, but I'm trying to do that because I think that ChatGPT did just kind of like bust open the pinata of like that generative data augmentation idea.
Yeah, okay, that's very interesting. I'll also check that method you mentioned, right? The 2 weeks came out 2 weeks ago. Okay, thanks.
Mehrdad, any comments?
It was great work, very intense work. So congratulations, you have already done a lot of things. So, and I'm just curious. It's a personal, question to train myself. In general, regardless of what model or machine learning model you use, what is the standard for testing? So I saw you had a two diagram shows eventually it should, you have to reduce the error for training error and testing error. Is there any specific survey in the literature just talking about errors in machine learning algorithms?
Yeah, that's such a great question because there's like things like what's this?
Yeah,
like
I'm talking about this.
Oh yeah, as you see, like like early stopping is what they call that, where the error like plateaus. So you say, okay, let's stop this because it's usually expensive and to keep training it. So if it plateaus, you'd say, okay, let's stop doing it. But yeah, like these kind of plots, they're usually just like and maybe I would add one more thing to that is there's usually like this Pareto frontier of compute and loss where you say, okay, it's like this is the optimal amount of compute because the additional decrease in loss is no longer worth the additional cost of continuing to train it.
Okay.
But generally it's just this train test idea, like in this diagram where where all you're doing is, you're training it on the green set and testing it on the blue set. But I think with what robustness shows and domain generalization is, I think this is too shallow of a way of looking at the performance of the model. I think you need specific kind of test sets that are, maybe it's like, I think it's still out there exactly how, like with the Keras-BERT examples, as I was optimizing it on all the data, I was looking at its performance on each individual source of data to try to get a better read on it.
So for sure, the training error is related to the error that you get from your training data, and the testing error is the error that you get from testing data, right? And is it always the case that the error that you get for training is less than the error that you get for testing, or it may not be the case?
It's a great question. I think if it's maybe early in training, your test, because the optimization is going to like directly reduce the training error, even though there can be these really like you can have these obscure optimization landscapes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my last question, usually in the software engineering field, to deploy something for real world application, they say we start checking the system, and then as soon as we reach to a certain threshold, let's say based on the sensitivity of the system, when we get the error of 0.009, let's assume it's for airplane, then it's safe enough to release the software. So do we have something like this in your field, or still it hasn't been written or regulated in your field to have these standard before releasing any AI system or whatsoever?
Yeah, I love that question. That's exactly what I've kind of found, is that there's no kind of system. And if it's like the kind of, I know I've been saying the ChatGPT thing too much, but it's such an interesting case. But it's like this system is just kind of generating you text. So you say like, write me a tweet, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, it's like fine if it's bad, but in the case of the self-driving car or the medical image prognosis, these lack of these tests, I think, is such a problem.
Okay. So if you ever come to any paper talking about these things, errors, so please send it to me. I'm very interested to learn more about this area.
Yeah, Merda, this was a great question by you. We don't have a standard, what you are trying to say for AI, what the algorithms tool that we deploy, that what kind of minimum error rate is acceptable and so on. We don't have, but this is a great question, but it is evolving field,
Yeah, I think you have done a lot of great surveys, Taghi. Maybe at some point you should hire some student just working on standardizing these error rates in machine learning, because as Connor mentioned,
I think that's also related to different application. They may have different, threshold, right, for software to release.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true.
Yes, that's true. But ding for, because if the system is safety critical system, my goodness, they should be very, very low. But if it's the system is not, so is what acceptable,
Yeah, that's true. Great work, and good luck.
Yeah, thank you for Merdad and Ding participating. And this is Connor, you recorded this, am I right?
Oh yeah, let me stop the recording.
Just want to make sure if you have recorded that, because I need the link for the other two